Now, we want to use this morning to both speak to some of the themes of the book, but also to locate the book within the contemporary context that we are all confronted with, and that, of course, we are baffled by, trying to make sense of and trying to understand what is the scale and the scope of what this reflects and what this represents. And where exactly is the urban agenda going to go to in the midst of COVID-19 and its afterlives? Now, all of this discussion and the book is structured around the life of the City Support Program in the first 5 years of its incarnation. And for those who may not know, the City Support Program was born in the National Treasury in consultation with other national departments and other spheres of government in the wake of the National Development Plan. And essentially, it took its cue from the debates that informed Chapter 8 of the NDP around urban and human settlements transformation. And it tried to understand what can national government do using certain fiscal and regulatory instruments to work more closely with the 8 metropolitan governments of South Africa to help them to become sharper and more focused in dealing with particularly spatial inequality and spatial injustice. But there was an understanding that this had to be done in a way that engaged with regional economies and also tried to connect and deep economic analysis with thinking about long-term resilience and sustainability, specifically the climate change implications. Now, the program invariably was complex. It had multiple dimensions. We'll hear a little bit about that from some of our speakers today. But at the heart of it, it tried to innovate by bringing a new bespoke planning instrument to bear in the context of metropolitan governance. This instrument was called the Built Environment Performance Plans. And what this required of municipalities was to strengthen the evidence base for the analysis of regional economies and the drivers of spatial inequality, and to use that analysis to become better at prioritization and sequencing of various infrastructural investments, but always with an eye on crowding in economic players and civil society, always with an eye on thinking about what does these new investments mean for long-term resilience. Now, given the overburdened, if you will, intergovernmental system in South Africa, given the plethora of planning and regulatory and other instruments that metropolitan governments have to contend with in engaging with provincial and national government, it was, of course, a big ask for metropolitan governments to buy in. But I think one of the outstanding features of the City Support Program was that it was positioned as the name suggests, a supportive mechanism. And it really took seriously the idea that it had to co-produce with metropolitan governments a localized response that was embedded within the administration. So not only did it expect a new planning instrument, but it also provided ongoing support. And critically, it gave resources or allocated resources to build a new language, a new vocabulary through bespoke leadership development. And in the process, what it was trying to do was to embed this idea of prioritization, strategic focus, with a new normative framework about what metropolitan leadership looks like, what the political administrative interface within that context of new leadership looks like. And so there are many stories about how it tried to experiment and innovate around that. And of course, the book tries to document all of that. With the benefit of hindsight, what is very clear is that the CSP was clearly extremely ambitious. It was a complex program, but it was also significantly informed by international experience. So when the CSP approached ACC about 2 years ago, whether we'd be interested as a knowledge partner to critically engage with their practice, to try and document what the first 5 years represented of the program and think about its broader implications, we obviously jumped to the opportunity. And the agreement from the beginning was obviously that we would not sacrifice our academic independence, but we would be sympathetic critics. So what the book then tries to do is to not just document the first 5 years of the CSP, but it also locates that within the longue durée. It locates that within the 20th century context of urban policymaking in South Africa. And then it focuses in on the broader post-94 context. And if nothing else, beginning to think and recognize government innovation and policy within these larger arcs, I think helps us to get a bit of distance and a bit of perspective, both in terms of how hard we often are on ourselves, on policy failure, if you will, or frustrated policy, but also to recognize the significance of South African innovations in a larger context. Now, this approach to the work was very much conceptualized and driven by one of our panelists, Susan Parnell, who is a professor in human geography at Bristol University and a founding member of the African Center for Cities and an advisory board member of the African Center for Cities. And Sue worked very closely with the two other co-authors of the book, James Dermody, who I believe is amongst the attendees, and Mercy Lutango-Brown. James was central in drafting large chunks of the book, and Mercy worked very closely with James and Sue in conducting the fieldwork, data gathering, and drafting. And we are incredibly proud of what they were able to achieve in this book in a very short period of time. Now, what is interesting about this for us is that this for us represents a different form of establishing a university government partnership, a knowledge partnership, I should say. And later in the discussion, we want to circle back a little bit to that, to reflect about how we can do more, how we can do better, and how we need to think about such partnerships if we want to truly embed innovation. Now, how we've structured the morning is we've got 3 speakers. I've already introduced Sue. Our second speaker will be Malijeng Ngqaleni, who is the DDG for intergovernmental relations in National Treasury, and who has been the leader and custodian of the City Support Program in all of its phases. And finally, we will have Professor Phil Harrison from WITS, who holds an NRF chair, and I always forget the name of the chair, so that slipped my mind, but of course, Phil needs no introduction, a lead character within the National Development Plan, and particularly Chapter 8, and part of the expert panel with IUDF, and of course himself, a senior manager in the city of Johannesburg before he returned to the university. So we couldn't really think of a better placed person to offer a response and set of reflections. And I want to thank all of our panelists for being willing to engage with us today. So without much further ado, I'm going to give over first to Sue. And what we've asked our panelists to do was in the first slot is reflect on how the ambition of the CSP, the learnings that we've gathered from that process, how to think about that in the context of this unprecedented moment that we confront now with COVID-19. And of course, what is significant about the last few months is the fact that things we thought were unthinkable, unsayable, never in our lifetime, are now all of a sudden common sense, are things that are very much at the heart of governmental responses across the world. Of course, not everywhere, but I think South Africa is proving particularly fertile for radical thinking, radical propositions to find an opportunity to find expression. And so we're going to first just ask our panelists to maybe ground us in the current moment, share with us their reflections before we return to the theme of experimentation and learning in the second half of this webinar. So Sue, thank you for joining us, and wonderful to see you. And we, of course, for once jealous of your weather in the Northern Hemisphere. And please share with us your initial thoughts. Thank you.
Yes, I don't want to rub it in, but it is 26 degrees and sunny. It's lovely to be here. I just wish it really were in person. So virtual hugs to many of the extraordinary human beings who I see are in the room, so to speak. And so I look forward to that discussion. I wanted to start off by saying I think that South Africa is particularly well positioned to make the most of the COVID crisis. You know, there's always that logic of you must never miss the opportunities afforded by a crisis. And in part in the urban context, that's because of some of the thinking that's gone into the CSP. And when I was reflecting on what might be useful entry points to this, I was thinking about the 3 things which I think helped us conceive of and approach a reflective moment around the CSP. So not necessarily the CSP itself. Others in the room can speak much more to that. Malijeng in particular will pick up on some of those things. But the way that we were able to kind of think about what it represented and why that was important. And there are three aspects of that that I think are useful for thinking about the post-COVID urban moment. The first thing is that I think that it provides the opportunity to think about an alternative city. So you've seen an awful lot of this in the kind of the urban, what I would call the urban press. What kind of city can we imagine? And the CSP did that. It was thinking about kind of, we really are wanting to imagine a non-racial, spatially reconstituted space. And the post-COVID moment has generated exactly that kind of thinking at scale internationally. Much of it has been driven by urban designers, as you would expect. So this is the lovely stuff about, can we treble the pavements and put trees down the middle and take the cars off the road? Some of it has been around alternative forms of urban social protection. So whether that's as basic as kind of, washing facilities in the streets, or basic income grants, because those are really critical for urban people, or rates rebates from particular cities. There has been very limited discussion, and I think the CSP has been very much better about what service models need to look like, which are universal. And the SDG kind of echo there, I think, is really important, and to go back to and to link that to. But there's that kind of utopian visioning that I think a crisis always represents, and we should certainly be claiming that. It's not, I think, the dominant mode, and certainly the challenge in contexts like ours is to think about, what does that mean? What do these large infrastructural investments mean in informal settlements? Are we actually fundamentally talking about a re-regulation of pedestrianised spaces, of public spaces, and what do they mean in that context? Because I think a lot of the people who are driving the revisioning of space in public places in cities of the global north are doing so in an infrastructure-heavy, investment-heavy kind of way, that they're using the momentum that COVID has provided to push through agendas that have been nascent for some time. They're doing it very well, I think, in some places. But I don't think there's an equal or a bold enough imaginary coming out of where we come from. And in part, the CSP didn't get down to all of those particularities, and we can talk about why. That's the first thing. The second thing that I think the post-COVID urban moment enables us to do is to reimagine government and governance in the urban context. Now, you'll have seen a lot of that in the kind of intellectual press, which is about kind of the rethinking of the state and the recentering of the state in a global political imagination and in global politics. And I mean, even very conservative parties are very, across the world, are pushing for a much more explicit role of the state and a kind of a pullback from some of the sort of earlier neoliberal ideas. I don't think that this means a conventional return to the welfare state, although there is this really big discussion about social protection. But what there is implicitly is a recognition of the hidden, the intangible, the indirect, the support mechanisms that states provide to cities. And I think it's in that context that there are some very important lessons from the CSP, where part of what was being undertaken in the book was a rethinking of what government did and how government could facilitate partnerships and how government could play an enabling role across sectors, across conflicts, in order to catalyze interventions. And that's a very different return to debates about public policy and to debates about urban public policy that are really important and prescient, because we're not only looking at a post-COVID world, we're also looking at a post-COVID cities, post-climate change, dealing with climate change and biodiversity and social equity issues all at the same time. So I think some of those questions about how states manage and navigate and facilitate those kinds of interactions has been there. Crucially, the second thing of how we rethink the city has been the issue of devolution. And as you know, South Africa has always had very strong local government, particularly in metropolitan areas. But what the CSP represents, I think, is a very conscious effort to recalibrate and redefine the terms of national local engagement. Okay, so in other words, it's part of national government coming to the urban question, sometimes in a supportive role and sometimes actually recognizing that some of what they have done has actually been problematic and learning to retreat from that role. So it's a shift away from that command and control relationship, and it's a shift away from a straight fiscal relationship. In other words, where finance is also associated with expertise and innovation, and we might want to come back to some of that in those questions. So I think it's a reworking of conventional devolution politics, not necessarily around where does power lie, but rather around how is power shared across quite complex scales of intergovernmental relations. And the CSP reflection, I think, is helpful in understanding that relationship in a way that goes beyond what a lot of national urban policies do. So that's the second big domain. And then the third, which is for me actually the most important part, and many people would think about this as the least important. The how should we reimagine cities is sexy and it's wonderful. It's like the architects, you know, you imagine you're going to rebuild your house and you're going to redesign it. And, you know, that's Edgar smiling because I guess, it's incredibly important because the original conception is really fundamental. And then that question about kind of, what are these shifts and can we actually do it? For me is a little bit like kind of, what are the regimes within which you're allowed to do this renovation to your house? It's kind of like going to the bank and making sure you've got enough money and working out how long the term of repayment is. It's about making sure you're doing it within the law so that you actually haven't, you know, kind of contravened the boundaries. It's kind of, it's the broad regime, fiscal and legal regime in which you operate. But once you've got both of those things secured, you still actually have to do the thing. You still actually have to build. And in a way, for me, that's the main part of the CSP. It's about how do you actually do these reforms? And this is the stuff that's kind of, it's detailed, it's about implementation, it's about the navigation and the negotiation of politics. And it's in that space that the CSP, I think, helps us to think about how do you make large-scale transitions in cities? And it's very clear that there are going to have to be post-pandemic transitions in our cities. Lots of people have been saying that for a long time. We might want to ask very explicitly why the health agenda has been so weak in the urban space. And I think some of it has to do with that second point about our governance arrangements and how inappropriate they are and the dominance of a health facility at national government and a provincial government, not at local government. But we've really missed the step on that. But there are other places where we've been better. And I think what's really useful and what was useful in putting forward the CSP thinking and reflecting on it was some of the money for this, the ACC contribution came out of a project called Peak Urban. There's a website, you can have a look at it. And what the Peak Urban framing did was to say, look, we need to understand the long-term trajectories. We're not desegregating well enough. We're not changing our spatial form. But we also need to understand the emergent properties which are associated with those long-term trajectories. So that was the E. And that was things like, actually what we're doing is we're marginalizing more and more people. We're not effecting large-scale transformative action. We are entrenching inequality and some of the systemic reasons why we can't change cities. And then they had an A, which is unlike a lot of complex systems thinking about cities and what was to be done. And the A was really about how do we adapt? How do we actually absorb and implement these regimes of transition and change that mediate these conflicts and help to prioritize interventions? And I think that's essentially what the CSP is about. So whether when we look at the transport chapter, whether we look at the human settlements chapter, and probably crucially look at the BEPS, where a mechanism was introduced precisely to think strategically about how these issues came together. And it's exactly in that we might want to go back and say, that was a really interesting intervention. Can we amend, adapt to think to include some of the post-pandemic dynamics, whether they're around proximity, whether they are around basic hygiene and sanitation, whether they are about access to fundamental kinds of services, like can you or can't you get contraception, can you or can't you actually walk safely to go and get food. But it's precisely in that realm of what are we actually putting in place and who are the political parties that regulate that space, both formally and informally. Because there's no point, and what the CSP does very well, book does very well, I think, and James was very influential in this, was to backcast, to say, look, we've made changes in cities in South Africa before. They tended to be driven very top down through a judicial commission and a change in the law. We can't do that in that way anymore. How else are we doing it? And we're doing it through a much more diffuse form of influence. And I think it's in that respect that there are some lessons from the CSP, Edgar, for thinking about the post-COVID environment. Do we add, do we amend, how do we reflect on these additional challenges, and how do we ensure that we get catalytic interventions? The last part of the PEAK is the PEAK is about knowledge. And you've already highlighted that. And at least for me, looking at the CSP extended family, some of whom I think are present today, what was really crucial was about creating a cohort of leadership. A cohort of leadership, not just that was ready to learn from each other, but was ready to think about the problems and the kinds of interventions that there might be. Now, COVID has been very serious, but we also have to face the fact that there may well be much more serious urban challenges to come. And so the question that we face is, what do we learn about the ways that we reconfigure? And I'll just end quickly by summarizing. We absolutely need to think differently and big and in alternative kinds of ways. We fundamentally need to shift our urban governance regimes so that the intergovernmental arrangements work well, work better, and are enabling. And then finally, and crucially, we cannot forget the technical, administrative, capacity-based interventions. And for my money, that's probably where we should be spending a lot more money. And we can show the rest of the world that that's as important as redesigning triple-size pavements, although I'd love to have a triple-size pavement from Fish Hoek to Simonstown for us all to stroll down together one day.
Thanks, Sue. I'm just getting my mute trigger finger to work more quickly. That was a fantastic kick-off and framing for the rest of the discussion. And one of the things about the current moment, given the issues that you've raised, of course, is how replete the times are with irony and contradictions. And in something I read recently, there was this amazing quote by the godfather of neoliberalism, Milton Friedman. And the quote reads as follows: "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function: to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes politically possible," end quote. I can't think of a more reassuring sentiment about, as progressives, why we do the work we do, whether it's within government or in civil society or the academy, because the need to systematically think through things and substantiate radical alternatives never goes away. And who knows what might happen in the future that creates an opening for the mainstreaming of that. So on that note, we now turn to Malijeng, who has been there from the outset with David Savage and a number of others to conceptualize and introduce this program into government. And Malijeng, if you can share with us your reflections on what COVID represents and how what we can learn from the city support program to help make sense of our current times and what the possibilities are. And thank you for joining us and welcome. Wonderful to see you. The floor is yours.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Edgar, and the team of writers that dared to put this together and bring about the great reflections that probably would not have an opportunity to make by ourselves. So we do appreciate that. So I think, as you said, Edgar, that CSP was really designed as a very ambitious and ended up being very complex program. And because it was aimed at addressing a very intractable problem of reversing the apartheid spatial legacy, which we at the time we were saying we have been so many years, but we have been investing in such a way that we are not actually bringing about the change of inclusion in our spaces and in our economy. So it became a very ambitious program in that sense. So what I think COVID has done is that it has actually exposed the failure of the public sector, in a sense, to drive the programs of investments that actually transform the spaces and ensure the inclusion of the marginalized. We have failed to do that with speed and with impact. And obviously it does reflect and validate the ambition that the program CSP had in terms of trying to make a rapid change in those areas. So our failure on the upgrading of informal settlements, access to services in those informal settlements, became very evident and very visible. And we ended up coming up with very expensive measures to try to make up for the gap. So what it has done also for me is that it has brought suffering to the forefront. It has made it visible, the plight of the poor who are living in squalor conditions. It has, as a result of this visibility, made government also to resulted in a very unprecedented response, in government, putting up huge resources that we actually don't even have, struggling to have, to safeguard livelihoods and to protect lives. And we have seen those who can afford also making contribution, and therefore you see the society like response in seeing the need. So I think for me, that really represents perhaps a silver in the lining of the dark cloud of COVID. That which says to me is that perhaps the exposure of the suffering that perhaps many of our leadership were maybe hidden to it has touched the hearts of the leadership and bring about change in consciousness. And giving them even a much stronger vision to use the power that they have to really better the lives of people instead of serving themselves. So I think this, for me, addresses the issues of the functioning of our governance systems and inherent in that in the leadership that is able to take courageous decisions around the investments that are required, the choices that are required to drive spatial transformation and implement those decisions. So those governance has been quite a key pillar that we acknowledged and recognized that, if we don't have the leadership in our cities that is able to drive this program with courage and with skill and consistency, then we'll not really see the change that we need, because you've got to stay with it for years. You can't have it when it changes every year. So we do need to, so I think what it also exposed, the COVID for me, is the limitations of our intergovernmental system. So you could see a situation where we wanted to respond we put the programs in place and national decides, but how those programs then reach out and the interface between the different spheres of government in implementing those programs like social relief, has been an issue of coordination. And we also saw there, even with the society in general, the NGOs, the issue of coordination and alignment. There was a lot of action, but sometimes not so effective in actually reaching out because of duplication, fragmentation, others falling out of the system. So I think the issues of our own intergovernmental system, and so it became very, very clear in there. What it also says to me is that the tools that we established in CSP 1, and those that we're beginning to experiment and innovate with are still quite relevant. So we need to find more ways of actually innovating to ensure this coordination, to ensure this collaboration and alignment within the private, within the public sector. So, and I think the key for me, which also lies in that area that we say is governance, is really around how we partner, not only within government, intergovernmental coordination and alignment, but it's also about how we elevate the value of citizens' engagement and partnership with the private sector so that we can really drive true development. So this essentially requires that we bring people at the center of their own development, so that we don't continue trying to do it for them without them. This certainly says that government needs to learn, and I think that has been one of the major issue and fear that we saw across government, that when the communities are coming together and trying to be part of the solution, they become like they are political. They bring fear to the government, officials, and I'm hoping that. That will change so that we can actually bring the community together and be able to reimagine our cities together, re-strategize together, and really make the choices that will benefit the majority, not the few. And in that sense, I believe that there lies the key in actually scaling up informal settlement upgrading and achieving inclusion, because I don't think that can be achieved through high, capital, or infrastructure-led only. That does not have strong community mobilization and leverage of their capital. So essentially, the issue of collaboration is not only in government. I would believe that between firms, businesses, communities, we need that. And we have simply people coming through in different formations, coming through and trying to help. But maybe because it has not been our strong culture, that is why I believe we're kind of stepping on each other's feet in trying to do that. So, but I'm hoping that what COVID-19 has exposed is that we can't continue working in our own silos, whether it's within government, between government, and there's a difference for formulations of civil society, that the different way of working that actually can bring about better collaboration and partnership is actually going to be quite key. So I think from where we sit, we believe that we need to expedite the scale up those interventions and initiatives and reforms that we have laid out and piloted through the City Support Program. And obviously the COVID-19 has created even a major issue in terms of the fiscal constraints. So our constraints fiscal, and while on the other hand, the demand for services because of unemployment increasing becomes actually even more elevated. So forging partnership will be quite key for government. And it means that in terms of how we drive developments, we need to be able to push far more collaborative developmental agenda. So if we can't, then I don't think we can actually take the steps that we need to take to really fast and be able to address the needs that are actually arising. Thank you.
Thank you, Malijeng. That was fantastic and really helpful. And I think we'll return to this question of how does government learn. But before we get there, let's learn from Professor Harrison. He could unmute himself and share with us his reflections. Thanks, Phil.
Thanks, Edgar. I'm just getting organized here. So thank you very much for the opportunity to provide an input. Where I'm sitting is really frigid, so I'm sure you'll see me shivering. And also I'm a bit worried about internet connection. So you may hear me in fragments, but one of the points I want to make is about how we only know in fragments at the moment. But really, first, my congratulations, my admiration to the authors. This was an immense undertaking, and the product really is critically important to all of us concerned with urban change. I sat down on Monday, and I sat down to read it, but I realized it cannot be done in one sitting. It requires time for absorption and reflection. And I really respect National Treasury and the CSP for being open to evaluation and critique. And there's so much to be said about the book. But I'll just mention one phrase up front, which I think captures so succinctly a view on the CSP, which I subscribe to. And it says, imperfect, yet significant and innovative. So we were asked to reflect briefly on the present moment in relation to the book. And in the email that was sent as briefing, there was a far-reaching statement, and it's been repeated again today. And that is that COVID-19 has demonstrated that our conventional approaches, based on the assumption that radical change is not possible, has been swept aside. And I'm going to take a quite cautious position on this statement with elements of agreement and disagreement. And my point of agreement is that this clearly is a time to shape narratives, to put efforts into influencing a discourse. It brings the new possibilities into a realm of imagination, hopefully into a realm of practice. It is the opening. My disagreement, I guess, rests on one fundamental premise, and that is we can only see dimly at the moment. There are currencies, there are counter-currencies. What will emerge from the mix in terms of influencing discourse, politics, resource configurations is unknown. And of course, the constraints of the past are not suddenly removed. And I'll elaborate a little bit on that. The big theme, I think, for this morning is the learning theme. Learning from CSP Mark 1, and also the entry into another phase of learning from the COVID-19 and responses to COVID-19. And so how effectively we connect the learnings from these different periods is really important. And presently, I think we need to, particularly in the academic environment, is to gear ourselves to support and structure learning processes in the post-COVID era. So for me, the one fundamental point of clarity about the present moment is its radical uncertainty. And this speaks to what responses are required. I enjoy going back to history, and certainly if we go back to the stock market crash on Black Tuesday, which is October the 29th, 1929, which was perhaps the most significant moment of the 20th century. I mean, if we had lived then, could we have imagined the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, World War II, the reorganization of geopolitical power, the Cold War, everything else that flowed? So will this moment, the precise date unknown when the coronavirus leapt from some unknown animal to a human being, will it be as pivotal? From perspectives in the future, will it prove to be the great turning point? Will it be known as the beginning of a succession of crises, even more devastating, even more transformative? Or will we return more or less to where the world was with some adjustments? We don't know, we can speculate, but we can't rest our hopes and strategies on one version of the future. So a few scattered points, I think, in relation to this uncertainty before coming to a critical matter of how we might respond. And the first is, and this is why the book is really important, the past is not erased. However radical the change may prove to be, the past remains significant, and so an important contribution of the book is its understanding of the palimpsest, and that's a word used in the book, of history. The world will be changed, but it's not been made anew. It's hard to gain perspective from inside the crisis, but we must have the perspective at least that we are in the inside. And the issues which predated COVID-19 remain, and we must stay the course in addressing them. Poverty, inequality, climate change are certainly as relevant now as they ever were. And certainly one of the difficulties that the current crisis presents is a reorganization of priorities to respond to the current crisis. And we know, for example, that funding has been shifted away from sustainability and climate change programs. And it speaks also to the history of responses, the NDP, the IUDF, the Land Reform Program, the strategic thrusts of the CSP are not suddenly irrelevant because of COVID-19. We need to absorb the lessons of COVID-19. We need to respond to the crisis, but not be thrown off course in terms of a longer term agenda, which has evolved through struggle over the past few decades. We also need to secondly recognize that COVID-19 and responses are having variable impacts in different places, and the discursive consequences of these are going to be confusing. So if we take the case of the role of government, especially of national government, in some cases, South Africa, I think, included, the crisis has reinforced the authority of government and has brought into the realm of possibility bolder approaches into the future, and hopefully bolder approaches in dealing with the social crisis which existed before COVID-19. It has illustrated that government can act radically when it needs to. And for us, the challenge may be how to sustain the gains of the present and systematize them and upscale them. But there are many other contexts, and the discourse will emerge from those contexts where the crisis has undermined the possibilities of radical intervention by the state in the future. There are many contexts where government has been immensely incoherent in its response to crisis. Brazil, the US, and there's a backlash against the action of government, often driven by right-wing populism. So in Spain, for example, national government is facing a class action for negligible homicide. And so because of this confusing discourse that will emerge, we have to be clearer in what we're saying, and in what we're saying about how the crisis can be, the effects of the crisis and the learnings of the crisis can be upscaled into real changes in terms, and enduring changes in terms of government and governance. We need to understand that crisis is an opportunity for expedience, positive and negative consequences. It provides the cover for achieving objectives that are often extremely difficult to attain under ordinary circumstances. And we know it from history. Sue can tell you about the outbreaks of the plague during the early years of the 20th century, the opportunity for segregationists to achieve their aims. And there are indications of this sort of expediency also in the with the current crisis providing a cover. But the positive spin, of course, on expedience is really strategic opportunity. But as Malijeng has said, the one fundamental issue we have to bring into the discussion in terms of moving towards taking the strategic opportunity is the fact that we are going to face a massive fiscal challenge. It's not the end of World War II, when the USA was ready to mobilize massive resources to launch as the Marshall Plan for Europe. It's a period of national isolationism, with each country desperately focusing on its own challenges and trying to deal with post-COVID reconstruction in the context of reduced fiscal capabilities. And it is this reality, both the need to take advantage, but the context of fiscal scarcity, and also the context of radical uncertainty as the condition of the present, that I think will drive us towards the next theme in our discussion, and that's the theme of innovation. And just quickly, just 2 points in relation to this. the first point I want to make is that response innovation is happening at multiple scales and in all aspects of life currently. We might not recognize it as innovation. We can't even necessarily discern its significance. But economies, educational processes, civic organization, neighborhoods, urban spaces, institutional mechanisms, these and many other dimensions of life are being altered through the crisis. And so we can call these changes forms of emergence. We don't know how resilient they will be. We don't know whether or which ones will routinize into new patterns and processes. Some will, some won't. But for me, a really productive role for governance currently, and also for scholars, is to discern the emergence. And where this emergence offers progressive opportunities is really assist in upscaling, in recognizing, upscaling, and institutionalizing emergence that offers progressive opportunity. And we can see it, those who are close to government can see it in the way in which agencies are operating that are beginning to break old patterns. Even our opportunities really of walking the streets from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m., the walkers, the cyclists, the runners reclaiming the streets from the motor car for a few hours. It suggests possibilities that something the open streets movement has been trying to do for decades, and there are many, many other examples. Somewhere in the book, the role of the CSP was expressed as being about connection, consolidation, refinement, scaling up of urban reform initiatives. It's the support, it's the co-production. And there's such an extraordinary opportunity for that now, because of the way in which the crisis, I think, has unleashed a whole set of creativities and innovations, even if we don't see them yet. And let me just finish, and let me just say that the CSP approach, as expressed in the book, was really helpful to me in thinking about what an experimental, learning-based, adaptive, supportive approach, rather than a directive approach, could be. Because in emphasizing the CSP as innovation and as experimentalism, it didn't present a future of its disconnected, disjointed, incremental approaches. Rather, the CSP approach was incremental but structured. The strategic themes were really important. It was open-ended. It emphasized co-production, but there was also the discipline of an outcomes-based approach. It was incremental, but it was bold, as David Savage was cited in saying, linked to large flows of cash, which gave the initiative real leverage. It was located in the strategic heart of government, of national government, but had this intergovernmental framing. And its focus was on support, but it also used the incentives to shape behaviors. And there are many tensions in all of this, and the CSP didn't get the balance right in all sectors and on all occasions, but I think this experience is immensely informative. I'm reminded of the Ministry of the Cities in Brazil with its city support approach. The ministry went awry after a few years, and the CSP more or less held its course. But I think what both institutional experiments do is to provide a really rich resource to draw on as we enter this new phase of learning in an altered context. I'll leave it there for the moment.
Thank you, Phil. I'm sorry to break it to you, but your connection was crystal clear. So we heard every word.
Oh, no.
It was incredibly sobering.
That's a problem. That's a problem. I was hoping it was fragmented.
So I'm afraid you didn't have a poetic echo of the gist of your reflections. Thank you. That was incredibly powerful and helpful. So I want to, there's a couple of things to pick up on, but before I do so, I just want to use this as a quick advertorial and just indicate to the participants of the webinar that you can go to the ACC website and download the book. It is available for download since this morning. And since midnight, there's also an accompanying YouTube summary of the findings of the book and CSP Mark 1. So please feel free to access those as open source resources. Now, I'm just looking at the time and I'm looking at the incredible array of participants. And so if my panelists will indulge me, I'm gonna open the chat function for people to pose questions. I'm also gonna ask the participants to essentially ask questions directly. And the moderator of the forum, Alma, will just allow people, once they've raised their hands, to speak. And can I ask people to please just introduce yourself, the institution you're from, and if you can restrict yourself to one question, please, or one remark. We only have half an hour remaining in the webinar, and there's more than 90 people in the webinar. So if you could please be mindful of that. So Alma, if that's okay, if you can do whatever technical magic has to be done to allow people to speak. And I've got Ashraf Adams and then Roland Hunter in the queue to ask questions. Ashraf, can you go first, please?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me, I presume?
Yes, crystal clear,
yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, I have a different view. I'm Ashraf Adam from the Mandela Bay Development Agency. And if you look at what's happened in the last few weeks since the advent of the lockdown and all that other kind of stuff, has been the issues of race and class in South African society. And it's in that context that I actually want to argue that CSP was a failure. And CSP2 is also going to be a failure and a monumental waste of money, because it did not address the actual issues around South African cities and governance around those kinds of stuff. And if you look at what has happened, nothing has changed. In fact, I challenge, without having read the book, I challenge anybody to say where, in which municipality, the CSP was actually successful in transforming that municipality into a better governing institution. And I'd be very keen to learn about that. So to make it worse, CSP structured on space, and I disagree with you, Edgar, when you say it actually allowed for innovation on cities and structures of cities and things like that. It didn't. It imposed a particular structure from the World Bank, and wherever the same structure of corridors and nodes are being promoted, that's all the CSP did. And if you look at the issue of the BEP is an IDP by another name, and carries the same kinds of information, the same kinds of spatial structure, the same kind of ideas, issues around budget. Nothing has changed around that kind of stuff. So my point is that what should have been looked at are the limitations of the intergovernmental system, which is related to performance. Again, I disagree with you, Edgar. It is not structure. It is a systems, it's a performance of the system, which is people related, not the IGR structure as a whole. So I think that the CSP tried to solve problems as they present themselves instead of the underlying governance issues. And so my challenge to the National Treasury and at this time of COVID is to look at the epigenetics of our society, what makes us who we are, and why the structure of corridors and nodes will fail as a tool in urban integration, because we haven't understood what makes us who we are. And I think that we need to begin to look at that. The other thing that I think you need to look at as Treasury in this time is, of course, the basic income grant. And then thirdly, the alternatives to alternative infrastructure rollout. But more than that, I actually think Treasury should ask itself, why is it even in this space, and not insisting that other spheres of other parts of government play their role that it should be playing in terms of the law and the constitution and so forth. So those are just my comments. In fact, my final comment is how you as academics are going to change your minds. Because when I've heard Phil, I've heard Sue, it's all the same. I've heard this all before. And I want to know, having read some of your guys' stuff, what are you going to change in your minds about how you comment and write about the urban systems? Thanks.
Thanks, Ashraf. And obviously, it would be difficult to go through all of those, but I will leave it to the panelists to pick up what they want to pick up on. And if I can just ask people who will pose questions going forward to, as I've indicated before, if we can restrict to 1 or 2, that would be really appreciated. We move on to Roland Hunter.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I come from a different position to Ashraf, but I think it may end up being the same sort of question. You indicated Milton Friedman's comment about the ideas that are lying around, those come into play in a crisis. Dave Savage always used to say to us, never waste a good crisis. Now, the interesting thing about COVID is that I've heard everybody saying that, but everybody says it in order to advance their own pre-existing ideology. And that includes me and it includes Ashraf. So the crisis has not caused us with humility to open our minds to something different. The crisis has caused us to bed down our existing thinking and shout loudly about, come in my direction now that there's a crisis. So I just want to throw that one out, and linking it to Sue's point about the balance between the technical and the governance. That was what I found particularly interesting about the experience of working in CSP, but Ashraf's Metro provides an example. There were 5 mayoral committees in 5 years. What do you do with a situation like that? And the reason for the failure in Nelson Mandela Bay is a governance thing. And Ashraf is correct, we weren't tackling the governance. And what I mean by governance is actually politics. Within one party, you can have factions changing, the Metro changing hands, and then it wants to write a new IDP, it wants to write a new long-term strategy, and then when a new party comes in, they do it all over again. So this is now a political chaos, which is causing an administrative chaos, and it's causing me personally to think entirely again about localization and local initiative and local politics, because, and I'd love some comment on this, it feels to me that local politics has infected our administrative action such that CSP's work gets weakened. And I don't know how, we have to tackle that governance stuff, because otherwise all of the technical work gets wasted. Thank you. I'd love some comment on that.
Thanks, Roland. So I don't think there are any other hands up or questions. Okay, I've got a question from Catherine. There's a question from Alexis and a question from Catherine. So Alexis, can you go first? And then Catherine will pose a question about the post-COVID future. And then I'll hand back to the panelists to reflect on to respond to some of the reflections. Thanks. Alexis.
Thanks, Edgar. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Great. This has been a very informative session, and thanks for the thinking around it. I know many appreciate this kind of forum. I have a question around the city support programs, executive leadership programs. And as far as I know, the last batch of those was in 2018, and I just maybe some insight. I'm not sure who would be able to assist, but where those are and what's happened since those programs sort of kicked off and the impact around those, but particularly if there's a new iteration, a new generation of those programs coming out.
Thanks, Alexis. And then we'll just get the last question for this round from Catherine before she has to exit for a next meeting.
Have I managed to make the technology work for me? I'm assuming you can hear me, and my question relates to the usual economic premises of how we lend money to local governments and where local government and also citizens are expected to come to the party. And in some instances, and if we think of transport in particular, there's pretty generous capital funding to realize a public transport improvement. But user fees are supposed to cover maintenance and keep the system going. But in the ordinary world, user fees are not necessarily going to cover what is required to keep the system ticking over. And in COVID, that's even more extreme a problem. And I was wondering whether there are any thoughts regarding the actual combination of variable costs and capital costs and how we raise funds to sustain public service, not in the citizen sense or the person sense, but in terms of transport and human settlements and the like.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. Then the final question is from Sebongile, and then I'll hand back to the panelists.
Thank you, colleagues. Good morning. I just have one question in terms of the issue of in the governance focus. There's that instability of local government is as equal and as compared to the instability even in central department. Thus, the weakening of governance and capacity in all three spheres of government is actually quite real. Now, my question is, how can this be improved? How can CSP's impact be improved within such a very fluid type of governance and within a very fluid political arena in the politics of governance and in the politics of local government in particular? And I think this is for me critical because the sustainability of all these interventions are premised on the basis of traction within local government, but also traction in national government, because policy formulation emanates from national government. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sebongile. So I'll hand back to our panelists, and I think let's just reverse the sequence and have Phil kick us off, and then Malijeng, and then Sue. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, Ashraf's provocation. I mean, I think we have to have a serious discussion about what urban interventions can and cannot do. There are fundamental structural inequalities along race and class lines in the country, and the burden of resolving this can't rest on one sector, and certainly not on one small group of individuals within government. So the question is, are we going to set up enormous expectations from planning, for example? Or is planning parts of a broader set of interventions and part of something that should be more systemic within government? And is the challenge not really to learn lessons from the CSP and draw those lessons through government more broadly, so that we can tackle these problems in a more systemic and in a more systemic way? I think there's this huge frustration that planning hasn't resolved the problems in society, as though planning can. Planning needs to resolve what it can resolve and tackle what it can tackle. So there's a big challenge, I think, that we need to reflect around, particularly around this question of transformation. The common refrain is that we haven't yet achieved transformation. It's as though the world sort of stopped in 1994, waiting for us to catch up. But the world has continued to move on, and now we enter in a new phase of rapid contextual change, and the world isn't going to stop in 2020, allowing us to catch up. It's a continual task, and the question is, how do we pursue that task? I think the crisis is refocusing our attention on this question of governance. And there's an irony here. Because of crisis, because of uncertainty, we need to be more adaptive, we need to be more experimental, we need to be more learning-based, and yet we cannot do this unless we have the core of stability. To adapt to crisis, to be fluid, we need a strength in government that is often not there. And this, I think, is where both the technical and the political really do play a role. So let me just make one point which perhaps didn't come out strongly in the book, is that the CSP obviously was about the metros. And the challenge and the learning going forward from the approach of support for the metros, how can we really transfer that more broadly to the local governmental system? To what extent can the metros now become the support to the secondary cities and to smaller municipalities? Can we begin to multiply the learnings and multiply the benefits? And I thought that that was an aspect of the model, perhaps, which may need some critique, this very focused metro base to the model. Let me stop there.
Thanks, Phil. Malijeng?
Thank you. There were specific questions, one around the leadership program, whether it has changed because we haven't done in the format that we have set out to do in phase 1. So yeah, so we are rethinking our approach there, and part of the challenge is probably what Ashraf is mentioning here, because those leadership programs were meant to empower the leadership to be able to drive the program of spatial transformation, because we were bringing at the political level and administrative level. So what we realized is that you will bring them here to a workshop of a week, intense reflections. And it's a small group of people. So when they go back to the cities, there hasn't been very strong continuity in terms of the learnings. So what actually made that even worse is the discontinuity in terms of leadership. So if you make an example of a city like Nelson Mandela Bay, where there has been such rapid change in the leadership at a political level. And I think that is the issue that we are actually struggling with, because I don't actually think that a program of the nature of the city support program could actually in itself solve what is actually a political problem. So what we wanted to do was to work with what we have and to empower the leadership, because governance has been considered as a key pillar. Because if you don't have well-governed cities that are able to drive this program of transformation and inclusion, you will never be able to do it. And CSP on its own, with a small team of number of people, all we were wanting to do was to catalyze that in terms of the tools and instruments that we needed to do. But what actually made it difficult is the discontinuity in the political leadership. And I think it still becomes an issue now when you look at what is happening in metros, the instability that we're actually seeing politically, they do actually impact on continuity. And you cannot transform spaces if you don't have continuity, if we have change all the time. And I think that's the part that we need to be able to say, how can this be done? And I think one of the things that one is thinking about is, should we strengthen the incentive system in our grants, for instance, so that if you don't, there isn't a continuity in the plan over years, you know that you'll actually lose some money down the line. So I think those are some of that one is thinking from where we sit to say, how do you make sure that there is this continuity that we need in terms of the plans that we have, that the plans don't change because there's now a new crowd that has come into the system. So we are rethinking the leadership program to really begin to localize it more, to drive more of this transversal management, and really to begin to break the silos within the cities themselves, and also to strengthen connections between political and administrative level. So that is what we are looking at in terms of the CSP2. So when it comes to the issues of operations and in terms of the services, the balance between user and subsidies, obviously there is a challenge there, because if the public transport system is the way it is actually, where you don't have critical masses for ridership, which is what the system that we have now has, because of our spatial configuration, we will always have a problem. And the fiscals will not always have money to bolster the kind of spatial configuration that we have upon which our public transport is laid. Hence, linking the integration between your public transport development and your human settlement and all developments, that integrated approach becomes quite critical, because then you need to build the corridors whereby you are able to actually make transport much more efficient and reduce the need actually for more subsidies. But the way it is now, there's quite an imbalance in terms of the cost and ability to raise money for user fees and also then to provide subsidies. So it remains a big challenge that we have.
Thanks, Malijeng. Sue?
Thanks. I'm going to speak directly to the question of the role of academics, because the CSP was a direct partnership between an academic institution and the state in this process. And I think the first thing to say is that while it is absolutely true to say that race and class continue to be highly fragmented in a deeply unequal society in South Africa, all of the academic work reflects that the nature of inequality today, and particularly the nature of urban inequality today, is not always as it was. So I think we need to be very careful that we don't argue that things are the same just because problems persist. So that's a very important starting point, and that race-class politics in particular have to be tracked in order to ensure that we are targeting and understanding inequality appropriately. And I think academics are making a very conscious intervention in that. It's not always taken up as it could or should be in the political domain, and in fact in the popular domain. Speaking very directly to the CSP and to the arguments, the academic arguments that are there, and they reflect some of the wider academic arguments. And so, Ashraf, to your question of what would I do differently, I think some of what I'm saying here is we would say the same thing again and hope to be heard, which we may or may not have been already. And the first point that we make, and Malijeng underscored it, is that politics matter in urban policy. And that's both the politics of the street and of communities that she was speaking about. But the point that is made in the book, and perhaps not strongly enough and perhaps not critically enough, but it is unambiguously made, is that the state is a deeply political site of action and contestation. And as such, it needs to be thought about very, very clearly. The second academic point, which I think comes through from the book, is that structures really do matter. In other words, politics isn't just overt party politics or ideological politics. There is also a politics of the bureaucracy. And that is true in both the intergovernmental system and its organizing, and in the way that the law, the processes operate and have operated, that embedded historical traction really making a difference there. And Phil made those points on a number of different occasions. And then finally, I think the academic point that does come through, particularly with respect to cities, and Phil alluded to this, and I would say it slightly differently, but make the same point, which is that actually the role of planning in particular is not fundamentally to decide, change, and determine realities of cities. That lies way beyond and has never been the remit of planning. But what planning actually should do, both as an academic discipline and as a practice is to think very carefully about what it can mediate, how it can do that effectively, and to ensure and to optimize outcomes in line with the designated priorities of its profession. And in that regard, I think the CSP was very effective around infrastructure. We can debate whether the BEPS worked everywhere. I suspect that your own city is probably not the best example of that. But I think that the wider reflection and what the post-COVID environment enables us to do is to say, has the infrastructure turn, which has been fated by academics, actually been sufficient? I would argue it was necessary, but actually it's probably been to the exclusion of the debates about social security and the debates about human health. There have been people, academics, lots of them, in the urban health domain, making the case that there needs to be a much wider focus on health. Phil's point that we need to be very cautious that we don't just go down the infectious diseases route, and that we rather look more generally at how dimensions of urban health are resolved and integrated into climate-friendly cities, into more sustainable cities, is for me one of the places where there's very significant academic work, and we should be reading it and tracking it much more carefully. At the same time as we continue to engage in a dialogue that is grounded in real practice. And I hope that that's some of what the partnership with the City Support Program set in place, rather than actually providing a terminal point.
Great, thanks. So we're sort of in the last throes of the webinar, so I'm not going to open up for more questions unless I'm being told to do so. And I can't see for some the reason the chat function in my portal. Alma, just indicate if there's more questions. If I can't see my chat function for some other reason, I'll then just begin to make some concluding remarks.
There's no more questions.
Okay, thanks, Alma. So this has obviously been just a very provisional and scene-setting conversation, and I want to firstly just thank the three panelists for the amount of thought they've put into preparing for today, and I certainly found it incredibly rich and useful. I want to, I guess, start with Roland's reflection about that I share, that this has very much felt like a time in which a lot of people see this as an opportunity to restate long-held beliefs and claims, and connect that observation with Phil's compelling insistence that we cannot possibly know what is going on, that the conditions are too emergent, too contradictory, too complex, and that what is an important sensibility in a time like this is to pay attention, is to learn to be what it means to be watchful, to be able to distantiate ourselves from our inevitable preconceptions about how to make sense of the world. So I think the fundamental challenge for urbanists and everyone else is really, what does sense-making mean? What are the conceptual frameworks, the theoretical inheritances that we live with, that we need to recognize in ourselves and begin to shed, so that we can open ourselves up to a different kind of sense-making without obviously throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And one of the ways that Sue has suggested we cultivate the sensibility is to think what imagination means. What is vision? What is it to think into the future from a complex, cloudy moment? And how does that get bedded down with certain values and principles and so forth? And so this tension between insisting that an imagination, a rich, fertile, transgressive imagination, remains important, but at the same time that we don't forget we are in a moment of fundamental and deep and profound uncertainty, and we are living through a time in which pre-baked stratifications and inequalities will, of course, be amplified and extended into the future. And so this then takes us to the other reflection point of this morning, and that is a return to the political, to think about the nature and the forms and the symbolic representations of political power in its various manifestations. And one of the things the book does not get into, and that is certainly something that remains profoundly under-researched in the South African context, and I will sort of lay quite a bit of that blame at the door of political science, is a lack of understanding of the inner workings of political parties and how the life worlds of political parties spill over into formal governmental domains. And for CSP2 and the moment we're living in, we clearly need to remedy this conceptual and analytical blind spot. Yes, all of us have lots of anecdotal understandings and experiences and reflections on this, but it is very, very far from systematic. And we, as yet, I would argue quite strongly that we don't have a vocabulary or a coherent set of concepts to really understand what we do with the nature of the political as refracted through the life worlds and inclinations of political parties. And this is going to be absolutely critical for us going forward, as we already see, in a way, the workings of government much more manifest through the press conferences, the daily briefings, the sort of repertoire that we now have of kind of government laying its contradictions out for society to see in all its glory. The last point I want to then make is that if this is a sensibility we've got to cultivate, as how do we institutionalize this? How do we rethink and systematize learning? And here there's something about maybe not having paid attention to the importance of civil society and civic power. And even though this has been a strong concern within the CSP, there was never really a programmatic expression around how to engage with civil society, because of course the primary entry point was an intergovernmental system and metropolitan governments. And what we know across South Africa is that most municipalities are absolutely petrified of society and citizens. And so the instinct is to run in the opposite direction and pay lip service to a participatory ethos. And this is something we're going to have to come to terms with, we're going to have to deal with, because as I think also the panelists indicated, we are talking about, by definition, a co-production of understanding, prioritization, implementation between the private sector, civil society, and the state. The last point is that I think that what CSP did was to try and alter the decision-making and planning systems of local government. But what we really need going forward are deep test beds to begin to experiment with new technologies, new ways of working, new forms of infrastructure, new forms of regulation, and so that we can not simply tinker at the edges and modify, but we can take genuinely alternative ways of working and regulating and instantiate that into new forms of governance and regulation. And I look forward to see the workings of CSP2. I look forward to seeing how the participants in this webinar, the review of the book that Ashraf will no doubt pen, how all of that will help us to understand how we go forward in this. So with that, all that I want to do is to thank our panelists, is to thank the participants who've been part of this. And then I want to just very briefly do a